You stand in the sterile quiet of a museum conservation lab in Amman, Jordan, in the winter of 1952. Before you, laid out on a pristine white examination table, are fragments of copper, oxidized, brittle, and covered in ancient Hebrew letters that someone painstakingly hammered into the metal nearly 2,000 years ago. The conservator's hands, steady and deliberate, hover over the pieces with a pair of specialized tools. This is not parchment or papyrus like the other Dead Sea Scrolls discovered 5 years earlier by Bedouin shepherds in the caves of Qumran. This is metal. And metal, you understand as you watch, does not preserve text the same way organic materials do. Metal preserves intention. The copper scroll, as it will come to be known, was found in Cave 3 at Qumran in March 1952, but it took 4 years before anyone could safely open it. The copper had oxidized so completely that attempting to unroll it would have shattered the ancient artifact into irretrievable dust. So it sat, waiting, while scholars debated what to do. During those 4 years of waiting, you might have walked past it in storage and never known that inside this corroded tube of metal was perhaps the most controversial document ever found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. A document that some scholars would later wish had never been discovered at all. The decision was finally made to cut the scroll into strips in 1955 and 1956 at the Manchester College of Technology in England. Professor H. Wright Baker used a specially designed saw to slice through the copper in 23 sections. With each cut, ancient letters were revealed, and what emerged was not poetry, not prophecy, not scripture, but something far more troubling to the academic establishment: a treasure map. You lean closer to read the translation as it emerges. The text is written in a Hebrew that feels different from the other Qumran scrolls, more utilitarian, almost bureaucratic. It lists 64 locations where enormous quantities of gold, silver, and sacred vessels have been hidden. The quantities are staggering. In the courtyard of the platform, you read, in a cistern below the southern corner 65 bars of gold. In the cave of the old washer's chamber, on the third ledge 65 bars of gold. The numbers continue, location after location, until the total amount of treasure described exceeds the entire wealth that historical records suggest existed in Jerusalem before the Roman destruction in 70 CE. The academic response was swift and, you notice, almost defensive. This couldn't be real, they said. The amounts were too large. It must be folklore, or perhaps a training exercise for scribes, or maybe even an ancient work of fiction. John Allegro, the British scholar who first published the translation in 1960, disagreed vehemently. He believed the copper scroll was genuine, and he mounted several expeditions to Jordan to search for the treasures it described. He found nothing, but his conviction never wavered. The academic establishment, however, had made its decision. The copper scroll was curious, certainly, but not to be taken seriously as a historical document. But here is what you notice as you study the text more carefully, what the early scholars perhaps overlooked in their haste to dismiss it. The copper scroll contains geographic and architectural details that are extraordinarily specific. It references structures, water systems, and locations that wouldn't be verified as real until decades later through archaeological excavation. It describes a Jerusalem and a Qumran that the forger, if this was a forgery, couldn't possibly have known about in such precise detail unless they had actually been there, had actually walked through these spaces, had actually hidden something in them. And there's something else, something that makes your skin prickle slightly in the cool laboratory air. The copper scroll was deliberately different from every other scroll found at Qumran. It was written on metal, which was expensive and difficult to work with. It was hidden in a different type of location within the cave, placed there with clear intention to preserve it separately. And the language itself, that bureaucratic Hebrew, suggests not a literary work but a record. The kind of inventory that someone creates when they need to remember where they've put things of crucial importance. So you're left with a question as you stand there in that laboratory, watching the conservator carefully catalog each fragment. If the copper scroll isn't real, why did someone go to such extraordinary lengths to create it? And if it is real, what does it mean that scholars have spent 70 years trying to convince themselves? and everyone else, that it isn't. The answer might lie not in what the Copper Scroll says, but in when it was created and why. The consensus, based on paleographic analysis in the archaeological context of Cave 3, places the scroll's creation sometime between 50 and 100 CE. This is the period when Jerusalem was under siege, when the temple was about to fall, when the Jewish world was fracturing under Roman pressure. This was a time when people were hiding things, not just physical treasures, but knowledge, texts, and the very fragments of their identity as a people. In the months before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, the city was starving. The Jewish historian Josephus, who was there and witnessed it firsthand, describes scenes of desperate horror, people eating leather, mothers eating their own children, daily crucifixions of anyone caught trying to escape. In this context, the idea that someone would create an elaborate fictional treasure map seems almost absurd. Who has time for fiction when the world is ending? But the idea that someone would carefully, methodically record the locations of hidden wealth and sacred objects, wealth and objects that might be needed to rebuild after the catastrophe, to ransom captives, to restart a shattered society, that makes perfect sense. You think about this as you examine another detail in the scroll. Entry number 64, the final entry, is different from all the others. After listing a location near the tomb of Zadok, it adds, "This is a copy." The original is with, and then the text breaks off or becomes unclear. A copy, which means there was another scroll, perhaps multiple copies, and that the information in the Copper Scroll was considered important enough to duplicate. Important enough that someone wanted to ensure the knowledge wouldn't be lost even if one copy was destroyed or never found. But here's what truly keeps you awake at night. What makes this more than just an ancient inventory? The Copper Scroll has never been fully deciphered. Oh? Scholars will tell you they've translated it, and in a literal sense they have. But translation and comprehension are not the same thing. Many of the location names in the scroll don't match any known places. Some scholars suggest they're coded references, that the real locations are hidden behind cryptic names that only certain people would understand. Others argue that the geography has simply changed too much in 2,000 years, that valleys have filled in, structures have been destroyed, and what was once obvious is now obscure. This is where the story should become clearer, but instead it grows more complex. Because in 1961, just a year after the Copper Scroll was published, another discovery was made, this time in a different set of caves about 30 miles south of Qumran. These caves, in a place called Nahal Hever, are perched high on the cliffs above the Dead Sea. They're difficult to access, requiring ropes and considerable physical effort to reach. They came to be called the Cave of Letters. And what was found there would forever change how some scholars thought about the Copper Scroll. Israeli archaeologist Yigal Yadin led the expedition into Nahal Hever. What he found was staggering letters written by Shimon bar Kokhba, the leader of the Second Jewish Revolt against Rome in 132-135 CE. These weren't copies or later traditions. These were the actual documents from Bar Kokhba's administration during the revolt. Letters requisitioning supplies, military orders, personal correspondence. They had been hidden in the cave by refugees fleeing the Roman legions. People who climbed up into these nearly inaccessible heights, seeking shelter, and died there, leaving behind their most precious possessions. Among these possessions were documents that scholars hadn't expected to find: property deeds, marriage contracts, financial records. And, though this is mentioned only briefly in Yadin's published reports, references to temple vessels and hidden sacred objects. The refugees in the Cave of Letters knew about hidden treasures. They had documentation about them. They died protecting that knowledge. Now you begin to see the connection that made some scholars deeply uncomfortable. The Copper Scroll and the documents from the Cave of Letters speak the same language, not just linguistically, but conceptually. They both emerge from communities under extreme duress, communities that knew they might not survive, that were desperate to preserve knowledge about what they'd hidden and where. The Bar Kokhba letters are accepted as authentic by everyone. They're taught in universities, displayed in museums, referenced in countless scholarly works. But the Copper Scroll, which describes exactly the kind of hidden treasures and sacred vessels that the Bar Kokhba refugees knew about, is dismissed as fantasy. You start to wonder, is it possible that the academic rejection of the Copper Scroll isn't really about evidence at all? Is it about something else, something more uncomfortable? Because if the Copper Scroll is real, it means there are, or were, enormous quantities of treasure hidden in locations throughout the Judean wilderness and in Jerusalem itself. It means that beneath modern buildings, under Christian and Muslim holy sites, in caves that haven't been explored, there might be repositories of wealth and sacred objects that belong, legally and morally, to someone. And that raises questions that no one wants to answer. Questions about property rights, about religious authority, about who has the right to excavate where, about what happens when ancient claims collide with modern politics. John Allegro understood this. It's why he became obsessed, why he spent the rest of his career arguing for the scroll's authenticity, even as his academic reputation crumbled around him. He wasn't treasure hunting in the conventional sense. He was insisting that history be taken seriously, that an ancient document created under desperate circumstances deserved to be treated as what it claimed to be a record. The fact that acting on that record might be complicated, might require difficult conversations and difficult decisions, wasn't a reason to dismiss it. It was a reason to engage with it more carefully. But engage carefully is exactly what didn't happen. Instead, the Copper Scroll was relegated to the category of interesting, but not reliable, curious but not actionable. It sits now in a museum in Amman. The copper strips carefully preserved behind glass, the hammered Hebrew letters still legible after 2,000 years. Tourists photograph it, scholars mention it in footnotes. And somewhere in 64 locations that may or may not still exist, in forms that may or may not be recognizable, treasures that may or may not be real remain hidden, waiting for someone to take their map seriously. The question isn't really whether the treasure exists. The question is why we've chosen to believe it doesn't, and what that choice reveals about how we decide which parts of the past we're willing to take seriously and which parts we prefer to treat as legend. Because here's what makes the Copper Scroll different from every other ancient treasure map ever created. It still exists. It's not a story told through layers of transmission and translation. It's the actual document, created by the actual people who did the actual hiding. And we've had it for 70 years. We've had the map for 70 years. So why haven't we followed it? And what does that say about us? About what we're willing to know, and what we prefer to leave buried? You stand there in that laboratory, in that museum, in that moment of decision that keeps recurring across decades, and you realize that sometimes the most revealing thing about a historical document isn't what it tells us about the past. It's what our reaction to it tells us about the present. The Copper Scroll continues, section after section, location after location. In the great cistern which is in the court of the peristyle, in the plastered reservoir vessels of pine resin and vessels of senna and alms money of the house of Matania. The detail is extraordinary. The specificity is undeniable. And the silence from the archaeological establishment grows louder with each passing year, a silence that itself becomes a kind of testimony, a record of what we choose not to pursue, not to question, not to dig up even when we're given a map that tells us exactly where to look. You arrive at the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem on a morning in late October 1987. The building, constructed during the British Mandate period, has the heavy, imposing architecture of colonial confidence, cream-colored stone arched windows, and a tower that dominates the surrounding landscape. Inside, in a climate-controlled room on the second floor, is the epicenter of Dead Sea Scroll research, the Scrollery. This is where, for nearly 4 decades, a small group of scholars has controlled access to the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century. The room is not large, perhaps 30 feet by 40 feet. Along the walls are wooden frames holding fragments of ancient scrolls, thousands of pieces ranging in size from postage stamps to dinner plates. Each fragment is carefully positioned between sheets of glass, protected from light and humidity. In the center of the room are worktables covered with photographs, transcriptions, and reference materials. And at one of these tables, bent over a particularly complex fragment written in a cryptic script that only a handful of people in the world can read, is a man who will be dead within 18 months under circumstances that no one will adequately explain. His name is Joseph Malik, and he is one of the original team members appointed in 1953 to edit and publish the Dead Sea Scrolls. He is Polish Catholic, trained in paleography and Semitic languages, and by 1987 he has spent 34 years working on the scrolls. He has published some fragments, but he has also held on to others, kept them private, restricted access to them even from other scholars. The academic community has grown increasingly frustrated with this possessiveness, but Malik has reasons he occasionally hints at but never fully explains, for his reluctance to release certain materials. You watch him work. His movements are precise, economical. He makes notes in a cramped hand, cross-referencing with earlier translations. Periodically, he pauses to examine a fragment through a magnifying glass, his face so close to the ancient text that his breath fogs the protective glass. He doesn't acknowledge your presence. He's used to observers, to visitors who come to the scrollery with various agendas and levels of understanding. Most of them bore him. Most of them ask the wrong questions. But you notice something as you watch him. There's a tension in his shoulders, a wariness in how he glances toward the door. It's subtle, but it's there. And when his assistant brings him a message, a note on plain paper, folded once, you see his jaw tighten. He reads it, crumples it without a word, and returns to his work. But his concentration has broken. His hand hovers over the fragment without moving for several seconds. Then he abruptly stands, gathers several photographs into a folder, and leaves the room without explanation. This is 1987, and the Dead Sea Scrolls have become a scandal. For nearly 40 years, since the first discoveries in 1947, the public has been told that translation and publication are progressing steadily, that the scrolls contain interesting but not revolutionary information about early Judaism and the origins of Christianity. But increasingly, questions are being asked. Why are so few scrolls actually published? Why is access so restricted? And most troublingly, what's in the unpublished fragments that we're not being allowed to see? The official answer is that the work is complex and time-consuming, that rushing publication would lead to errors, that the appointed editorial team needs to maintain academic standards. But this explanation has worn thin. 40 years is not diligent care, it's suppression. And Joseph Malik, who controls more unpublished material than anyone else on the team, has become the focus of particular suspicion and resentment. You learn, through conversations with other researchers who've worked in the scrollery, that Malik has become obsessed with certain fragments, not the biblical texts. Those have mostly been published or assigned to other team members, not the community rules or the hymns. Those too have seen publication. But the fragmentary texts that hint at messianic expectations, that contain calendar systems that don't match the traditional Jewish calendar, that reference practices and beliefs that suggest early Judaism was far more diverse and complex than the tidy narrative taught in seminaries and Sunday schools. These are the fragments Malik guards most jealously. In particular, you hear whispers about a text that Malik has been working on since the 1950s, but has never published. It's referred to in internal documents as 4Q246, and the few scholars who've been allowed to see it describe it as explosive. The fragment is small, only 9 lines preserved, written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew. But those 9 lines contain a phrase that appears nowhere else in the Dead Sea Scrolls, a phrase that would become intensely controversial when it was finally published years later. He shall be called the Son of God, and they shall call him Son of the Most High. You can understand immediately why this would be problematic. This is language that closely echoes the Gospel of Luke, where the angel Gabriel tells Mary about Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. The implications are profound. If this phrase existed in Jewish messianic texts before Christianity, it suggests that early Christian language about Jesus was drawing on existing Jewish expectations rather than introducing something entirely new. It complicates the traditional narrative of Christian uniqueness. and it raises uncomfortable questions about the relationship between the Qumran community and the earliest followers of Jesus. But here's what makes the situation even more complex. Milik doesn't just refuse to publish this fragment. He actively discourages others from discussing it. When colleagues press him, he suggests the text might be misunderstood, that the context is unclear, that premature publication would lead to sensationalism. Yet he doesn't publish his own interpretation either. He simply holds onto it, year after year, while the fragment sits in its protective glass in the scrollery, known to exist, tantalizing in its implications, but inaccessible to the broader scholarly community. By 1987, the pressure has become immense. The Biblical Archaeology Review, under its aggressive editor Herschel Shanks, has begun a campaign to force open access to the scrolls. Articles appear with headlines like "The Scandal of the Dead Sea Scrolls" and "Who's Afraid of the Dead Sea Scrolls?" Shanks accuses the editorial team, and Milik in particular, of sitting on materials that could revolutionize our understanding of early Christianity and Judaism. He suggests that religious interests, both Catholic and Jewish, are influencing what gets published and what remains hidden. The accusations are inflammatory, and they're not entirely without merit. The original editorial team was appointed by Father Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican priest who directed the Qumran excavations. The team was deliberately ecumenical, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish scholars working together, but it was also conservative in its theological orientation. None of the original team members were likely to publish interpretations that would seriously challenge traditional religious narratives. And Milik, despite being a brilliant scholar, was also a faithful Catholic who understood the theological implications of the texts he was studying. You watch him return to the scrollery several hours after his abrupt departure. He looks tired, older than his 64 years. He sits back down at his worktable but doesn't resume his examination of the fragments. Instead, he pulls out a notebook, not the official research journal that the team maintains, but a personal notebook with a worn leather cover, and begins to write. His hand moves quickly, filling page after page with cramped text. You can't read what he's writing from where you stand, but you can see from the intensity of his focus that this isn't scholarly transcription. This is something else. This is personal. Later, you'll learn that Milik kept extensive private journals, that he recorded not just his scholarly observations, but his doubts, his concerns, his growing unease with the entire project of scroll publication. These journals have never been published. They remain in private collections, inaccessible to researchers. But colleagues who knew Milik well have suggested that he became increasingly troubled by what he was finding in the scrolls, and more specifically by the pressure he felt to interpret those findings in ways that didn't challenge orthodox religious beliefs. There's a particular incident that several sources mention, though the details are disputed. At some point in the 1970s, Milik was apparently working on a fragment that contained calendrical calculations. The Qumran community used a solar calendar of 364 days rather than the lunar calendar used in mainstream Judaism. This wasn't news. The calendar difference had been known for years. But this particular fragment, according to Milik's own notes, appeared to calculate dates for future messianic events, suggesting that the community expected specific things to happen at specific times. And one of the dates mentioned, reconstructed from the fragmentary text using the Qumran calendar, fell in the early 1st century CE, right around the time of Jesus' ministry. Milik never published this fragment. He never discussed it publicly, but he mentioned it to a few colleagues, and his interpretation, as they remember it, was deeply troubling to him. He suggested that the Qumran community might have been expecting a Messiah to appear at a very specific time, and that when someone, possibly Jesus, possibly others, did appear making messianic claims at around that time, it wasn't coincidental. It was fulfillment, or attempted fulfillment, of a pre-existing expectation. The Gospels present Jesus' arrival as divinely ordained, unique, and unexpected by anyone except through prophetic hints in ancient scripture. But if Milik was right, Jesus' timing was exactly when a significant Jewish community expected their Messiah to appear. based on calculations they'd been making for generations. This interpretation would undermine claims of divine uniqueness, while simultaneously suggesting that the Qumran texts predicted the arrival of a messianic figure in a very specific time period, a claim that both Christian and Jewish authorities would find problematic for different reasons. Christians would struggle with the implication that Jesus' timing was based on human calculation rather than divine will. Jews would struggle with any suggestion that these calculations successfully predicted a messianic figure, even if Christians misidentified who that figure was. So Milik stayed silent. He kept working on the fragment, refining his translation, but never moving toward publication. And as the years passed, his silence became more difficult to maintain. The pressure from Shanks and others intensified. Other scholars began to challenge the legitimacy of the entire editorial team's monopoly on the scrolls. There were calls for the Israel Antiquities Authority to remove the team and open the materials to broader access. In November 1989, Joseph Milik died in Paris. The official cause was listed as complications from surgery, though the specifics were never made public. He was 66 years old. His death was announced in the scholarly journals, with the usual respectful obituaries noting his contributions to Dead Sea Scroll research. But among those who knew him, who'd worked with him in the scrollery, there was a different conversation happening. They noted that Milik had seemed increasingly stressed in his final years. They mentioned his cryptic comments about certain texts being dangerous to publish. They wondered about the contents of those private journals, now locked away in collections that have never been made available to researchers. And most troublingly, they noted that several of the fragments Milik had been working on most intensively in his final years, including the Son of God text and the messianic calendar calculations, had disappeared from the scrollery. Not permanently, they would resurface later when new editors took over the scroll publication project. But for a period after Milik's death, these particular fragments couldn't be located. They weren't in their usual storage positions. The photographic documentation was incomplete. It was as if someone had deliberately removed them from the collection, though for what purpose and by whose authority was never determined. The scrollery feels different now, in the years after Milik's death. You visit it again in 1991, and the atmosphere has changed. The monopoly has been broken. The Israel Antiquities Authority, responding to intense pressure, has opened access to the scrolls. Photographs of all the fragments have been released. Scholars from around the world can now study materials that were previously restricted to the small editorial team. It feels like a victory for academic freedom, for transparency, for the principle that ancient documents belong to humanity, not to a self-selected group of gatekeepers. But you can't shake the feeling that something has been lost in the transition. The new scholars are competent, enthusiastic, and refreshingly open about their work. They publish quickly, they share data, they collaborate internationally. Yet none of them seem to carry the weight that Milik carried. The sense that they're working with materials that could genuinely upend established narratives. They treat the scrolls as fascinating historical documents, certainly, but not as dangerous ones. They've domesticated the material, made it safe for academic consumption. You wonder if this is progress or retreat. If opening access to the scrolls has made them more available but less challenging, if the very process of democratizing access has also sanitized interpretation. Because here's what you notice as you read the new publications. The most provocative possibilities are mentioned, acknowledged, and then carefully explained away. The Son of God fragment, when it's finally published, is interpreted as referring to a Syrian king or a future Davidic ruler, not as evidence of pre-Christian messianic expectations that influenced early Christianity. The calendar calculations are treated as community administrative documents, not as predictions of when the Messiah would arrive. The connections to Christian origins are noted in footnotes, and then dismissed as coincidental or insignificant. It's all very scholarly, very careful, very measured, and it feels somehow like exactly what Milik feared. The dangerous materials have been made safe through the simple expedient of refusing to take their most challenging implications seriously. The scrolls are published. Yes, but they're published in a way that doesn't require anyone to change their fundamental assumptions about Christian origins, Jewish diversity in the Second Temple period, or the relationship between ancient expectation and historical events. You think about Milik in those final years, sitting in the scrollery, reading texts that suggested his faith tradition had emerged from a richer, stranger, more complex matrix of Jewish expectation than the official story acknowledged. You think about the pressure. He must have felt the pressure to publish, the pressure to interpret carefully, the pressure to maintain theological respectability, while being honest about what the ancient texts actually said. And you wonder if his death, convenient in its timing, allowing the transition to a new editorial team without the awkwardness of removing the old guard, was really as simple as surgical complications. There's no evidence of foul play, no suggestion that anyone wanted Milik silenced. But there's also a pattern here. A pattern you're beginning to recognize as you study the history of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The scholars who push hardest on the most challenging interpretations tend to suffer professionally, personally, or both. John Allegro, who insisted the Copper Scroll was real and suggested the scrolls revealed uncomfortable truths about Christian origins, died in obscurity with his reputation destroyed. Milik, who held on to the most problematic fragments for decades, died just as those fragments were about to be forcibly released. And the scholars who prospered, who built successful careers on scroll research, were invariably those who found ways to make the materials interesting but not threatening, illuminating but not revolutionary. The question you're left with as you leave the scrollery that day in 1991, walking out into the bright Jerusalem sunlight, is whether academic freedom means anything when the price of exercising it is professional destruction, or worse. Whether ancient texts can ever really challenge established narratives when the people who control access to those texts, either officially or through institutional pressure, have a vested interest in maintaining those narratives. Whether discovery matters when interpretation is bounded by unspoken rules about what conclusions are acceptable and which ones will end your career. The Dead Sea Scrolls are available now, published and studied by hundreds of scholars. But the revolution they might have sparked, the fundamental reconsideration of how Christianity emerged from Judaism, the recognition of how much early Christian language and theology was already present in Jewish messianic expectation, never quite happened. The scrolls were made safe, and Milik, who knew better than anyone how unsafe they really were, took his most challenging insights to his grave, recorded perhaps in those private journals that no one will ever read, understood by a man who chose silence over controversy, and who may have paid for that choice with more than just his reputation. You're standing in the Judean wilderness in the spring of 1993, about 15 miles south of Qumran, in an area called Wadi el-Marabalat. The landscape here is harsh, biblical in its austerity. Limestone cliffs, scattered acacia trees and caves, dozens of caves. The Israeli archaeologists excavating this region since the early 1950s have numbered each significant cave systematically: Cave 1, Cave 2. Continuing through the discoveries, you're interested in a cave that isn't on any official map, a cave that was explored briefly in 1957 and then sealed, with the Israeli Antiquities Authority recording its contents as minimal and insignificant. The local Bedouin, however, tell a different story about this cave. They call it something that translates roughly as the Cave of the Forbidden Scrolls, though they won't explain what makes the scrolls forbidden or why the cave was sealed. Getting permission to enter the cave has taken 18 months of bureaucratic navigation. The Israel Antiquities Authority doesn't officially acknowledge that the cave exists as a site of interest. When you submit your excavation proposal, referencing the 1957 survey report that briefly mentions the cave's discovery, you receive a form letter stating that all significant scroll caves have been thoroughly excavated and published, and that further permits for this region are being issued only for geological or ecological research, not archaeological investigation. So you reframe your proposal as a geological survey of limestone erosion patterns in the Judean wilderness, with a brief note that you'll be documenting any man-made modifications to cave systems as part of the broader landscape analysis. This permit is granted with minimal review. The cave itself is difficult to access, requiring a climb up a nearly vertical cliff face using ropes and climbing equipment. This alone suggests something significant. People don't put important things in easily accessible locations, and they don't seal caves that contain nothing of value. The entrance is partially blocked with stones that are clearly not natural fall but deliberately placed. Behind these stones, someone has plastered over the opening with a crude mixture of mud and limestone dust. You carefully document and photograph the seal before removing it. The plaster is relatively recent, certainly not ancient, but it's not from the 1957 expedition either. Someone else has been here, has sealed this entrance within the last few decades. Inside, the cave opens into a roughly oval chamber, about 15 feet deep and 12 feet wide. The floor is covered with a thick layer of bat guano and dust. The air is stale but not toxic. Your flashlight picks out details. The walls show evidence of human modification, with niches carved into the limestone at regular intervals. These niches are empty now, but they're clearly intentional, clearly designed to hold something. In a corner, partially buried under debris, you find fragments of pottery, 1st century CE based on the style and fabric, and then in a niche that's deeper than the others. Recessed so far into the wall that it's almost invisible, unless you're specifically looking for it. You find something the 1957 expedition either missed or chose not to report: a ceramic jar intact, sealed with a lid that appears to be original. Your hands are shaking slightly as you photograph the jar in situ before touching it. This is the moment every archaeologist dreams of. Discovering something that's been hidden and forgotten, something that previous excavators overlooked. But you're also aware of the implications. If this jar contains scrolls, and if those scrolls were deliberately left unreported by the 1957 team, then the question becomes why. The jar is heavy, which is promising. Empty jars are light. You carefully work the lid free. It's sealed with a resinous substance that's hardened over time but yields to careful pressure. Inside, wrapped in decayed linen, are 2 rolls of material. Not papyrus, not parchment, but something else. A textile that's been treated with some kind of preservative. As you carefully unroll the first piece, you realize with growing excitement that you're looking at text. Hebrew letters, written in a hand that's consistent with 1st century CE scribal work. The textile has deteriorated badly, much of the text is illegible. But you can make out enough to understand that this is not a biblical manuscript. This is something else entirely. The text appears to be an apocalyptic vision, similar in style to the visions described in the Book of Daniel or the later Christian Book of Revelation. But the dates mentioned in the text, and here's where your excitement begins to mix with apprehension, are specific in a way that biblical apocalyptic texts never are. The vision describes signs that will precede the end of the age, and those signs are tied to concrete historical events. When the Second Temple falls, and the eagle of Rome desecrates the holy place, when 70 generations have passed since the covenant of Abraham, when the star of the Messiah appears in the east, and the nations gather for the final war. You're not a biblical scholar by training. You're an archaeologist focused on material culture and stratigraphy. But you understand enough to recognize that this text is doing something unusual. It's attempting to calculate, to predict specific timeframes for apocalyptic events. And as you photograph the fragments and make preliminary transcriptions, you begin to realize why this cave might have been sealed. The 70 generations since Abraham is a calculation that appears in several ancient Jewish texts. If you use the traditional 40-year generation, 70 generations is 800 years. Traditional Jewish chronology placed Abraham around 1800 BCE, which would make the end of the 70 generations approximately 1000 CE. But other chronological systems existed, and small variations in how you calculate a generation, or when exactly Abraham lived, can shift the date by centuries. The point is, the text you're looking at is trying to use scriptural chronology to predict when the end times will occur. And depending on which chronological system you apply, the predictions could refer to events in the distant future, or they could refer to something much closer to the present day. You spend 3 days in and around the cave, carefully excavating the remaining contents, documenting everything. The second textile scroll is even more fragmentary than the first, but you can make out references to the gathering of the exiles in the land of promise, and the restoration of the kingdom of David, and something about signs in the heavens that will be visible to all nations. The language is messianic, nationalistic, and apocalyptic all at once. This is the kind of material that gets people excited, that generates headlines in television documentaries, and, not coincidentally, that makes both religious and political authorities deeply uncomfortable. On the fourth day, as you're preparing to transport the finds back to your laboratory for more detailed analysis, you receive an unexpected visitor. A representative from the Israel Antiquities Authority arrives at your camp, accompanied by 2 security personnel. He's polite but firm. There's been a review of your permit, he explains, and it's been determined that your work here falls outside the scope of geological survey. He'll need to confiscate your findings for proper evaluation by authorized scroll experts. This is standard procedure, he assures you. Your work will be credited, and you'll receive full access to the published reports once the materials have been properly studied. You know this isn't standard procedure. You also know you don't have much choice. The materials are logged, carefully packed, and removed. You're given a receipt and a promise of future access, but you're also asked, not ordered, but asked in a way that makes clear it's not really a request, to refrain from discussing your findings publicly until the official study is complete. 6 months later, you receive a letter from the Israel Antiquities Authority. The materials you discovered, the letter states, have been examined by qualified experts and determined to be medieval forgeries, probably created in the 13th or 14th century CE by Jewish mystics engaged in Kabbalistic speculation. The textile scrolls are not, the letter emphasizes, Dead Sea Scrolls are contemporary with the 1st century CE pottery you found alongside them. The pottery, it's suggested, was probably left in the cave by shepherds who used it as temporary shelter, and the scrolls were placed there much later by entirely different people. The materials are being catalogued in the authorities' archives as medieval Kabbalistic texts and are not considered significant for Second Temple period research. This explanation is technically possible, you suppose. Medieval Jewish mysticism did involve apocalyptic speculation and messianic calculation. But several things trouble you about this conclusion. First, the letter provides no detailed scientific analysis, no carbon dating, no paleographic study, no comparison with known medieval scripts, just an assertion of medieval origin from unnamed experts. Second, the sealing of the cave with modern plaster and the deliberate concealment of the jar in a deep niche don't fit the pattern of how people treat forgeries or worthless materials. You hide things that have value or that are dangerous. You don't carefully seal caves to protect medieval Kabbalistic exercises. And third, you remember the 1957 survey report, the document that first mentioned this cave's existence. You go back and read it more carefully. The report is brief, just 2 paragraphs, but one sentence stands out. Cave 60 contains ceramic materials consistent with 1st century CE occupation. Fragmentary textile remains observed but not collected due to extreme degradation. No further excavation recommended. No mention of scrolls. But fragmentary textile remains is an odd phrase to use for empty cave debris. And no further excavation recommended. In a period when every cave in the Judean wilderness was being intensively searched for scroll materials, seems like a deliberate decision to leave something alone. You begin to make inquiries. Carefully and formally, speaking with retired archaeologists who worked in the region during the early scroll discoveries. What you learn is fragmentary but suggestive. Cave 60, it turns out, was one of the last caves explored during the initial wave of scroll discoveries. By 1957, the Dead Sea Scrolls had already become internationally famous. The findings from Qumran had been announced. Translated scrolls were being published, and the implications for biblical studies were being hotly debated. There was immense pressure on the excavation teams to find more materials. But there was also, you're told, pressure of a different kind. Pressure to avoid finding certain kinds of materials. One retired archaeologist, now in his 80s, is willing to talk more openly. Over tea in his small Jerusalem apartment, he tells you about the atmosphere in 1957. The scrolls were exciting, but also troubling to many people, he explains. They showed that Judaism in the Second Temple period was far more diverse than anyone had realized, that there were multiple competing interpretations of Scripture, different calendars, different expectations about the Messiah and the end times. And some of the texts, he pauses here, choosing his words carefully. Some of the texts suggested that early Christianity hadn't emerged in a vacuum, but had grown out of very specific Jewish apocalyptic movements that had predicted a Messiah would come at a specific time, in a specific way. The problem, he continues, was that if you follow those predictions, if you take them seriously, they don't stop in the first century. Some of these groups were doing calculations that extended far into the future. They believed history followed patterns, that redemption would come in cycles, that if the Messiah failed to complete his work the first time, there would be another chance, another date, another fulfillment. He pauses again, sips his tea. That kind of material, calculations about future messianic events, makes everyone uncomfortable. Jews don't want false messiahs being predicted. Christians don't want the suggestion that Jesus' arrival was one fulfillment among many possible fulfillments, or that the real redemption is still to come at some calculated future date. And the Israeli government doesn't want religious movements gaining momentum around specific dates and expectations. You ask him directly, did Cave 60 contain materials like this? Did the 1957 team find apocalyptic calculations and choose not to report them? He sets down his teacup and looks at you for a long moment. I wasn't in Cave 60 myself, he says finally, but I knew the people who were, and I remember conversations, careful conversations, late at night, after too much wine, where someone might mention that certain things had been found that would be more trouble than they were worth, that some scrolls might be better left unread, at least for a while. He stands, moves to his bookshelf, pulls down a worn notebook. I kept records of everything we did, even the informal conversations. Nothing official, you understand. Just personal notes. He flips through pages, finds what he's looking for. Here, notes from a meeting in August 1957. Present were, he lists several names, all prominent archaeologists from the early scroll teams. The topic was protocols for reporting sensitive findings. The consensus was that materials dealing with future chronological predictions should be. He reads directly from his notes, set aside for evaluation by appropriate theological authorities before publication. You understand now. Cave 60 was sealed not because it contained nothing of value, but because it contained something too valuable, too potentially disruptive. The scrolls you found, assuming they're the same scrolls the 1957 team found and chose not to report, contain calculations about future apocalyptic events. And unlike the safely ambiguous prophecies in the Bible, these calculations were specific enough that people might try to act on them, might see in contemporary events the fulfillment of ancient predictions, might organize movements or make claims, or do any number of things that religious and political authorities would find threatening. But here's what keeps you awake nights, what makes the official explanation of medieval forgeries seem increasingly implausible. The calculations in the texts you found, as far as you were able to decipher them before the materials were confiscated, pointed to a date in the early 21st century. The 70 generations since Abraham, the restoration of the kingdom, the gathering of the exiles, all the apocalyptic imagery seemed to converge on a time frame that, depending on which chronological system you applied, fell somewhere between 2000 and 2030 CE. It's 1994 as you sit in your office, reviewing your photographs and transcriptions, one more time, before you're supposed to hand over all copies to the Israel Antiquities Authority. You've complied with their requests, filed your reports, accepted their conclusion that you found medieval materials that aren't significant for ancient scroll research. But you've kept copies of everything, stored in a safe deposit box, documentation of what you really found before the official story was written. And you're left with an impossible choice. Do you accept the official narrative, treat this as a closed chapter and move on to other research? Or do you push back, insist that the materials deserve proper scientific analysis? Risk your career and possibly worse to argue that an ancient apocalyptic text might be calculating dates that relate to the present day and near future. The sensible thing, the safe thing, is to let it go. The text is fragmentary anyway. Even if it's not a medieval forgery, even if it's genuinely ancient. The calculations could be based on faulty chronologies or symbolic numbers that don't correspond to actual calendar dates. And even if the dates are meant to be taken literally, they're predictions made by people who were wrong about many other things. Ancient apocalyptic groups consistently predicted the end of the world, and the world consistently failed to end. Why should these calculations be any different? But you can't quite shake the feeling that the very effort put into suppressing these materials, the sealing of the cave, the quick confiscation of your finds, the unsupported claim of medieval forgery, suggests that someone, somewhere takes them seriously enough to want them hidden. And if they're serious enough to hide, maybe they're serious enough to study, to understand, to preserve as part of the historical record, even if their predictions turn out to be as mistaken as every other apocalyptic calculation throughout history. You make a decision that night. You'll write up your findings, carefully documented, scientifically rigorous, but you won't publish them. Not yet. Instead, you'll lodge them with several academic institutions under seal, with instructions that they're to be opened and released in 2025. By then, if the calculations in the scrolls meant anything, if they were pointing to any specific time frame, that time frame will have passed. The predictions will have been tested by history, and whether they proved accurate or not, the materials will become historical curiosities rather than potential catalysts for apocalyptic movements. It's a compromise, a way of preserving the record while avoiding immediate controversy. But as you prepare the sealed documents, carefully labeling them with instructions for future release, you wonder, what if you're wrong? What if the calculations in those scrolls, made 2,000 years ago by people who believed they could decode the hidden patterns of history, actually mean something? What if 2025 is the year they were pointing to, and by sealing these materials until then, you're ensuring that no one will know what was predicted until it's too late to do anything about it? You seal the documents anyway. It's the only choice you can live with. The cave in the wilderness is resealed, this time officially, with no record that anything significant was ever found there. The Israel Antiquities Authority files your findings under medieval Kabbalistic materials, non-significant. And somewhere in a climate-controlled archive in Jerusalem, 2 fragmentary textile scrolls wait in storage, catalogued incorrectly. Hidden in plain sight, their apocalyptic calculations unread and unstudied, counting down to a date that no one has bothered to verify because everyone has agreed, officially, that they don't exist. The question that haunts you as you continue your career studying less controversial artifacts is whether ignorance is ever really protection, whether refusing to read a prediction somehow prevents it from coming true, or whether all you've done is ensure that when the date arrives, if the date means anything, no one will have prepared, no one will have understood, no one will have taken seriously what an ancient community believed was too important to be forgotten. So important that they hid it in a nearly inaccessible cave and sealed it away for whoever might come later, whoever might need to know.